Classical music is a term generally overused in modern genre-descript vernacular. Typically, when you hear someone describe their musical tastes, they may list them like rock or punk or jazz or classical, but if you're like me and try to play across genres when you can, you've probably come to the conclusion that rock has a ton of genres or punk has a ton of genres, some of which are the most punk of all. And jazz isn't so much of a genre as it is an idea. And classical, well, classical probably has edges too, right? See, classical isn't so much of an all-encompassing genre, it is a style. More specifically, classical is a musical conclusion commonly agreed upon by composers of the classical period between roughly the mid-18th to the 19th century. These composers were able to break the constraints of instrumental limits from the 17th and early century by tunings through like J.P. Rameau's tuning in early Baroque, which evolved to the famous well-tempered tuning perfected by Bach in the late Baroque, and then that evolved to equal and mean temperaments around the classical period. These new temperaments and the new instruments they were tuned to allowed composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven to dwell on key changes rather than pass through them. The ability to remain in certain key changes allowed for a fast evolution in composition, both for the constructs of composition like harmony, melody, rhythm, and dynamics, and for the forms of pieces themselves. For piano, this means that there isn't linear harmony. Here's an example of Bach's invention number 1. In classical period, we have things like broken chords, such as the Alberti's bass in this Mozart sonata in F major, or vertical or stacked chords, like this example from Haydn's Piano Sonata in E flat. New temperaments also meant chromatic stability. Clean-sounding half steps allowed composers to progress harmony simply by moving one or a few notes on a step-by-step basis. Here's an example in Beethoven's String Quartet No. 14, Movement 6. As I briefly mentioned earlier, several song forms found their perfection under the boom of harmonic advancement during the classical period. These advancements, like all things attributed to the classical style, were a collective development by composers and theorists. Some of these forms, however, like the macro forms of string quartet through Haydn, piano sonatas through Beethoven, and symphonies through Sammartini, were essentially perfected by their masters. The microforms of these pieces, such as Lars phrases or periods, are where composers left their signatures through thematic developments and clever key changes that bridge new sections. Here are two examples of thematic developments. Let's compare between Beethoven's Moonlight and Mozart's Lacrimosa. Listen for the chromatic stability between the voices and how they help the melody develop. All these pieces, form, chromatic stability, stacked harmony, dynamics, and thematic development, attribute to the ambiguous classical style, which owes thanks to the development of temperaments and the many composers who experimented with them. While true compositional style varies between classical era composers, they share a similar and overarching classical style, which defines the era and inspired so many after them to experiment and develop music.